Welcome back, guys, and this is our final video and our final set of slides. And what's nice is it's a nice quick last session. So the section we're doing now is Learning Outcome 2.3, and it's discuss the meaning and significance of the motif of darkness within the novella, drawing on language and narrative style as textual evidence. Now, I want you to remember back to the title that I made you think about right at the beginning of the lectures, where I said, what is Heart of Darkness to you? Is it a heart made of darkness? Or is it the darkness, the heart of the actual darkness itself? So this is what we're going to be discussing now. And what does darkness represent in this text? So darkness is the most pervasive of images and metaphors that are used. And importantly, we need to remember back to what we were talking about binaries in the last section. Darkness is part of a pair, and it requires light to be made sense of. And a lot of the time, it is used to illustrate a lot of the thematic concerns in this text, but it is not necessarily highlighting the themes and the ideas that you immediately assume that are linked with darkness, or perhaps it shows you darkness in the places that you least expect it to see. So when we think about darkness, and I've actually deliberately gone and I found a whole lot of covers about the most awful traditional ideas that I can find where people are talking about darkest Africa. Because when people look, I mean, look at this one. This is, I can just roll my eyes. When we talk about the title of The Heart of Darkness, a lot of the time it comes from this idea of visiting darkest Africa or traveling to darkest Africa and experiencing the wildness and the savagery that is there. And a lot of the time, this is also in reference to the people that are there and the perceptions of what Europeans perceive to be the people of darkest Africa. And there's a very negative set of responses and ideas that you get when people are perceived like this, or when you talk to people who are looking at this imagery from a very Western perspective. Now, this is all coming from the colonial heritage of writing about Africa from these people who would journey into darkest Africa and experience the wildness that was there. Now, obviously, I'm chuckling quite a lot here because even in Clyde Beattie's Darkest Africa, you have a lion fighting a tiger in Africa, apparently. So I'm not even entirely sure he was one of the people. So one of the first things that we need to recognize is that when we talk about darkness in Africa, it is an entirely Western construct. And although it might harken back to the idea of darkness being a lack of light, a lack of knowledge, a lack of education, it is also and most inherently ingrained with the negative ideas that come with darkness. This idea of darkness being a place of danger, a place of fear, a place where things can go horribly wrong. And think about what that could symbolize for a character like Marlowe, where he sees the consequences of this. He sees a space where Kurtz has gone into what is considered darkest Africa and turned into a monster. But is he turned into a monster because of Africa being dark, or is he turned into a monster because he was given free rein to behave like a monster, and he did so? So when we talk about darkness from the perspective of the reading that you were given, the no-fell reading, one of the quotes he has here is a comment and a reference to how this is a linguistic discussion. Linguistics is a reference or a study of how language works in society and how language works and is put together. So when we analyze something linguistically, we're looking not only just at how, we're not looking at language in terms of storytelling, we're looking at how a word has created meaning and how a symbol might represent, or a word might represent, a thing in the real world. So here we have this discussion that Nofal mentions. At the heart of the critical linguistic approach is the notion of ideology. Within critical linguistics, ideology is generally used to refer to the notion of a worldview or a value system. It refers to the fact that all speakers and writers necessarily operate with the assumptions, beliefs, ways of thinking, and expectations about the world that is, and the way the world is, and the way the world ought to be. So what this is talking about in terms of the critical linguistic approach, which is what Nofal is reading here to, or using here to analyze Heart of Darkness, you have this idea that Language and the way we choose to use language represents the way we think the world should be, or the way we experience the world to be in reality. And therefore, when we look at it from that perspective, is there an inherent power system and a hegemony that we create within language and the way we put language into play in the world? So one of the other things that he talks about here is civilization versus savagery. And he says, the theme of civilization versus savagery is central to Heart of Darkness. Marlowe's sudden assertion is that England is one of the dark places of the earth. The Thames was as a gate of the explorers and ambassadors of civilization. It also introduces the closely related theme of light versus dark, or white versus black. Light and dark have traditionally represented good and evil, and civilization has generally been viewed as good, while savagery has been viewed as evil. Conrad plays with this theme extensively, sometimes using the imagery in traditional ways and sometimes creating surprising, meaningful reversals. Conrad deals in this novel with the dark heart of mankind. He tells us that the man is inherently evil, masked by civilization. The civilized people create the morals to mask the truth that they do not want to see. Such masking is what makes us human. But what we misunderstand is that it is not only a mask and not a truth, that it is only a mask and not a truth, because one day we will be faced with the darkness of the true nature of the world. So what basically Nofal is suggesting here, I'm sure I'm pronouncing his name wrong, the suggestion here and inherently implied in the sentence is that one of the things that people like to perceive is that civilization is positive and civilization is the good, the light side. However, Nofal is arguing that civilization, the way civilization is being portrayed here, is a mask to hide the barbarism and the savagery underneath. And therefore, it masks the ugly bad side to what civilization has done. And therefore, civilization itself might not be the good side. Civilization might be the bad side because of the consequences of what civilization has done. So, what is the darkness that we think about in Heart of Darkness? And how is it represented? Where are there examples of it? And one of the things that we need to start off with is that when we think about darkness, we need to try and move away from our perceptions of darkness and engage with darkness the way that it is portrayed to us by Conrad. So here's one of the quotations. I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire, but by all the stars these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men, I tell you. But as soon as I stood on this hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of the land I had come acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be, too. I was only to find out several months later and 1,000 miles farther. So what we have here is this description of different types of devils and different types of evils. The first description is of strong, lusty, red-eyed devils, things that you are used to being tempted with, the temptations of violence and greed and hot desire. But here, there was this implication that there is another type of devil, a type of devil that is flabby, pretending, and weak-eyed, but that is full of rapaciousness and pitiless folly. Now, what is left up to the reader here is that you need to think about what is this representation of? What is this devil? So now what we're going to see here is a description of Kurtz. I had a vision of him on the stretcher, opening his mouth voraciously as if to devour all the earth within its mankind. He lived then before me. He lived as much as he had ever lived. A shadow insatiable of splendid appearances, of frightful realities, a shadow darker than the shadow of the night, and draped nobly in the folds of gorgeous eloquence. So here what we have, and this is the last sentence is really important, a shadow darker than the shadow of night, and draped nobly in the folds of gorgeous eloquence. What we have here is a description of Kurtz, who is eloquent and intelligent and speaks so well and can get you to agree and believe with him, but who is actually a shadow darker than the shadow of night. So somebody who hides behind eloquence and intelligence and cleverly spoken words, but is in fact incredibly violent and cruel and evil and represents darkness. I had to deal with a being to which I could not appeal in the name of anything high or low. I had even, like, I'm not going to say that, to invoke himself, his own exalted and incredible degradation. There was nothing either above or below him, and I knew it. He had kicked himself loose of the earth. Confound the man. And this description is of how unbelievably self-isolated Kurtz has become, and the only thing that matters to him is himself and his identity and his heritage and his legacy and what he will leave behind him in Africa after he is gone. And the tragedy of this moment is the fact that Kurtz himself has put himself in a position of such supreme authority and power that you could not dislodge him, and there was no way of getting through to him. You couldn't use European ideology of moral standards and religious goodness and humanity because he had used them himself. He believed himself to represent those. But you couldn't even use basic instincts because he had fallen so far away from those that there was nothing above or below him. He was, in his own mind, supreme, and therefore nothing could tackle him, nothing could lower him, nothing could make him reconsider his position. And therefore Kurtz, in the end, with all of his degradation and all of his problems and all of his nastiness, sort of becomes the representation of darkness, and darkness as portrayed by humanity. So here is the last activity I'd like you to do. All three of the quotations refer to Mr. Kurtz. And what I want you to do is answer these three questions. The first thing is, much of the novel is a build-up to meeting this character. What do we learn about him from the perspective of other colonialists? So what do we learn about him from the accountant, the manager, and the harlequin? What do we learn about him before we meet him? The second thing is, what do you think these three quotations tell us about Mr. Kurtz and Marlowe's opinion of him? What do they imply about him? So go back and re-listen to what I've just said, and that should give you a good little hint. And then lastly, what do you think Kurtz is symbolic as a representation of? What does he represent? Who is he, and what does he represent to us? So much of what we have as a concept of darkness from Conrad stems from where we think darkness comes from and the problems that darkness itself represents. However, something what we have forgotten is that the ideas of darkness and where darkness is and our representations of darkness are stimulated and created by what is darkness in terms of the Western perception, and how the Western ideals of darkness come from the sort of idea of primitivism, savagery, and a lack of education and a lack of godliness. However, a lot of what darkness is represented by in Conrad is actually what happens when civilized men are given rein to behave the way they choose and do what they will and be who they choose to be. And what does that imply to us? The other thing that is talked about here is that necessarily race and goodness and badness do not collide with one another. One of the things that this text has done, that he says and suggests very strongly, is that race and goodness and badness, or light and darkness, are not necessarily linked to one another. They are very strongly different things, and they do not need to be one coherent idea. They can be different ideas, and they don't need to be associated through traditional colonial ideas. This text, at the heart of it, has many problems. It has heavy racial implications. There's several discussions of Africa that are problematic. But one of the big things that we need to think about is that this is one of the first texts that allowed us to open up a discussion around the problematic nature of colonialization. And had it not been for a text like this, it is very unlikely that post-colonial texts would have taken on the form that they have now, where they are able to criticize the history of colonialization as much and as effectively as they have before now. And that is that. So, good luck to everyone with your assignments and your exams in this section, and I hope you do spectacularly.